Hi, I'm Morgan Swan. I'm the Special Collections Education and Outreach Librarian here at Dartmouth Library. Today I have a couple of things I wanted to show you, but first just a little bit about Dartmouth Library. The Special Collections Department is open to the public. We have all kinds of things in here. We have Babylonian cuneiform tablets going back to 1940 BC. We have Shakespeare's First Folio. We've got some amazing, crazy stuff here, and you're welcome to come in anytime you like. You can just walk in off the street and say, "Show me something cool," and we'll find something cool for you to look at right here in the reading room. And now today I've got a couple of things I wanted to show you I'm pretty excited about. One of them is an innocuous little postcard with a map on it, as well as a little bit of writing, but not much. It's kind of enigmatic, and we made a discovery here a while back that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. The other item that we have is this beautiful little volume that's bound. It has these nice metal clasps, and it's a story about an adventure into the New Hampshire, the White Mountains, back in the 1860s, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. So the first thing I want to tell you about is this little postcard. I want to tell you about this little postcard. It is it's pretty unassuming. It's just a plain, ordinary postcard, no address though on it, and on the front, on the blank side, is written W.B. Yeats, 18 Woburn Boulevard, Euston. And there's a little map with some streets, a church, a hotel, and then 18 Woburn Boulevard. And this was discovered in our Frost collection several years ago by the head of Special Collections, Jay Satterfield. And we weren't sure what it was doing in there. We knew that because it was among Robert Frost's papers, it must have been given to him at some point. And Robert Frost, as you know, is one of the most famous American poets of the 20th century. He's a New England boy. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, why does he have this little postcard and what does it mean? So we kept looking at it, kept trying to figure out what was going on with this. And then someone noticed there's a very distinctive E on Euston, this city, and it's the name of the city. And we connected it finally to another E that was in the correspondence among Robert Frost's papers, a letter written to him by Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a very famous, prominent American poet in the 20th century. He is an expatriate. He had moved to Paris and then later moved to Italy, which is where eventually he died. And we started putting the pieces together, and we realized that what had happened is that Ezra Pound had written this note to Robert Frost when Robert Frost and his family had lived abroad in England for a few years right before World War I. Frost was getting very little traction in terms of getting his first commercial book of poetry printed here in the United States. And so he moved his family over to England in, I believe, 1912. And it was soon after that, the year after, 1913, that A Boy's Will, his first collected book of poetry, was published in London and not in America, which is kind of ironic given how closely Robert Frost is united in our minds now with American poetry. So while he was in England, he had the good fortune to meet Ezra Pound, and Ezra was sort of known as a kingmaker in those days. He was so well connected. He had this huge network of writers, publishers, magazine editors, journal writers. He knew everybody in the literary scene, and if he liked your work, then you were set, because he would connect you to other people. And so Ezra was really excited about Frost's book of poetry. He insisted that he accompany Frost. The two of them should go down to the publisher right away while the book was being published to look at a fresh copy right off the press. And then Ezra said, "I'm going to write you a really positive review." And so he was actually the first American to write a positive review of Frost's poetry. Ironically, it took these two Americans to move and to be over in Europe to have this moment to eventually come back and publicize Frost in the United States. It wasn't until 1915, 2 years later, that A Boy's Will was published for the first time in America. So what's really cool about this postcard, and what gives me tingles about this every time I touch it, I'm getting them right now, Ezra Pound is hooking Frost up. He's connecting Robert Frost with William Butler Yeats, who was an Irish poet, probably one of the, if not the most well-known, most important poet of his generation. And so Ezra Pound is doing what Ezra Pound does best. He's saying, go see W.B. Yeats. He's a buddy. Tell him I sent you, and you'll be fine. You'll get to meet Yeats, which would have been huge for someone like Frost, who was just getting started, wasn't well known anywhere. America had never heard of him, and here he is. He's getting to meet all these amazing poets who were sort of the who's who of literary circles during the early 20th century. So I love this. I get chills every time. And then later on, Yeats would actually go on to say that A Boy's Will was I think he said something to the effect of it was the best poetry that had come out of America in a long time. Right? So this is really cool because this is the first time that Frost is getting to meet W.B. Yeats, and Pound's the one who's making it happen, which is pretty neat. Frost and his family moved back to the U.S. in 1915 after the war had started in Europe, and that's really where he began to get when he began to get some traction. He published his next book of verse in 1914, and actually his publisher in America joked about the fact that because he reprinted Frost's first book of poetry in 1915, Frost was actually competing against himself, because his first book, reprint of his first book, and his second book of poetry were both in the market at the same time. But that was definitely the kickstart that got him going. Okay, so the second thing I want to show you guys has nothing to do with poetry at all, but it's this fascinating little volume, and it's a travel narrative. There's some stuff in the front. It says, the opening page says, "Among the mountains," and the quote says, "There was an old woman, 1865. Like, what is this strange thing? This is a book about a group of ladies in the summer of 1864 who decided to go on a trip to Bethel, New Hampshire. And it relates all the places that they went, and it has all these beautiful inlaid photographs with hand-drawn imagery all around it. There's one of the ladies. There's another one. And then these beautiful images of New Hampshire, of the White Mountains, throughout. And it's a little, it's definitely a vanity book, but it's a fascinating little narrative that they actually paid to print this, which is kind of strange. What's really odd and really interesting about this to me is not just because it's cool, because it shows a slice of life in New Hampshire in the 1860s. Like, this is what people did for fun. They went and tried to climb Mount Washington and not die. But what's really interesting about this particular book is that it's in July of 1864. That's when Sherman is on his march to the sea. He's basically burning all of Georgia. The Civil War is it's in full swing. It's going during this time, and they're running off to the mountains to have a little getaway. And in the middle of their narrative, their discussion of all the things they're doing, they're talking about, okay, we're gonna go ahead and try to climb Mount Washington. And it says, so they get started, and then she says, "Oh, but the haze, that pertinacious foe adopting General Sherman's tactics, had constantly flanked us since we started from Bethel. Now, with provoking tenacity, it seemed to be taking position in our front up the mountain and concentrating to dispute our passage." So it's using this is really like sort of war, the language of war, to describe them going up Mount Washington, which seems, I don't know, it seems kind of in poor taste when all the South is on fire and people are dying left and right, which maybe sort of shows that how much they were really disconnected from the reality and the brutality of war at this time. So the short story is they give up, they come back to the hotel, and they decide to go bowling. That's it. But it's a weird little slice of life. If you're really interested in the White Mountains, you probably know it's been a tourist destination for a long time, all the way back to the American Civil War, if not before then. So those are the two things I have for you today. Again, my name is Morgan Swan. I'm the Special Collections Education and Outreach Librarian here at Dartmouth College. We always encourage idle curiosity. We would love for you to just walk in. If you're ever in the area, just say, "Hey, I'd like to see something cool," and we'll find you something. Thanks for being here.